The message did not arrive gently, it landed like a verdict that had already been discussed behind my back. My name is Alyssa. I am 32 years old, and I believed I was still part of my own family. It happened inside the family group chat, not privately, not with care, but in front of everyone who mattered to me. My father typed a message that still feels unreal when I replay it in my head. "We've decided you should step away for now." There was no reason given, no soft follow-up, no hesitation in the words, just a clean instruction to remove myself from a space that I had financially and emotionally held together for years. My mother stayed silent in that chat, which somehow felt heavier than any insult she could have typed. I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back, because I refused to argue in public or beg for a place I had earned through years of sacrifice. My reply was simple, calm, and final. "I'll respect that, and step away from the family entirely." A moment later, my sister reacted to my message with a celebration emoji, and that reaction said more than any words ever could. That night, I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I opened the investment account that had been built using my name, my credit, my trust. My hands did not shake. My breathing stayed steady. I made one decision silently in the dark. That night, I closed the $285,000 investment of mine that I had set aside for them. Before this story continues, and before you hear how far this went, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts, because what happened after that message changed everything I thought I knew about loyalty, family, and self-respect. Before everything broke, our family was already holding on by very thin threads. Our small seafood shack had once been a place people lined up for, a simple family restaurant near the water where neighbors came for fried shrimp, crab boils, and grilled fish. But when things started to slide, they did not slide slowly. They collapsed all at once. Suppliers stopped offering flexible terms, utility bills stacked in a locked drawer, and the daily customer count dropped so hard that the cash register began to feel like a prop instead of a tool. Mom reacted first, but not with solutions. She moved through the restaurant with a tight face, flipping through unpaid invoices, whispering numbers to herself, checking the same pile of envelopes again and again, as if they might change just by being looked at. Dad took the opposite path. He started making chaotic decisions, ordering more inventory even when refrigerators were already full, agreeing to high-interest short-term loans, without reading the fine print promising discounts to customers we could not afford. When both of them spoke, it felt less like leadership and more like panic disguised as authority. My sister Samantha was introduced in that season as the one who was supposed to be the creative voice of the family. She talked about rebranding, social media promotions, partnerships with influencers, but she never changed her schedule, never stayed late, never handled the vendors. Something shifted between us so quietly that no one noticed, but I felt it immediately, and from that moment on, Samantha felt more distant with every passing day. I had my own plans at that time, plans that required focus, relocation, and financial preparation, but I put them all on pause without making an announcement or asking for recognition. I started showing up after my own work days, staying quiet, watching the numbers, counting what was coming in, counting what was bleeding out. I did not ask for ownership, I did not ask for a title, I did not ask for praise. The first time I sent money, it was not dramatic. It was not public. It was not emotional. I looked at the numbers, saw how many days the restaurant could survive, and sent enough to keep the doors open a little longer. I told no one about it. I did not turn it into a family moment. I treated it like maintenance, like tightening a bolt before something snapped. That was also the moment I stopped helping from a distance. I began controlling what I could. I built simple tracking systems. I separated bills by urgency. I redirected vendor payments. I began speaking directly to suppliers so late fees would not destroy relationships that had taken years to build. I was no longer just a daughter trying to help. I was quietly functioning as the structure holding everything upright while everyone else reacted. By the time I realized how deep my involvement had become, stepping back already felt impossible. By the second summer, nothing serious happened without my approval. The business started breathing again, not because luck changed, but because someone finally stayed awake long enough to face what had been ignored. Days stopped feeling random and became structured since every payment, every supplier delay, every damaged piece of equipment had a voice waiting for answers. That voice was not loud, but it was steady. It was mine. Seafood suppliers were the first walls that needed moving. Conversations became uncomfortable quickly because unpaid balances do not soften just because a family looks tired. I learned how to speak without apologizing, how to buy time without promising lies, how to explain real numbers without letting them smell weakness. Extensions were not handed freely, but they came one signature at a time after long calls that drained more energy than any physical work ever could. Kitchen equipment contracts turned into another battlefield. Freezers that kept breaking, stoves that needed repairs, rental companies that stopped believing in excuses. Papers were revised, penalty clauses were stretched, overdue fees were turned into longer timelines. Every conversation required calm, even when my hands stayed tense. Every agreement required pressure, even when my voice stayed level. Debts did not disappear, but they stopped growing wild. Old balances that everyone avoided were pulled into clear lists. Numbers were no longer enemies hiding in folders, but became problems sitting directly in front of me. I stopped treating finances like storms that passed on their own and started treating them like broken pipes that needed hands on the valve. That shift changed everything. Samantha did not disappear during this time. Her presence lived in stories and updates delivered to others in smiles, shown when cameras were nearby. Work did not touch her hands, but visibility found her often. Compliments drifted in her direction, questions sounded like they belonged to her, while the pressure stayed somewhere else entirely. Something quiet hardened inside me during that season, but it never turned into shouting or scenes. It turned into distance that grew without announcement. My parents slowly began leaning on me without saying it directly. Decisions started coming to my side of the table without anyone naming why. Bills waited for my review before moving forward. Problems found their way to my phone without hesitation. Responsibility stopped feeling like a favor and started feeling like an expectation that nobody asked for, but everyone relied on. What changed most was not the workload, but the silence surrounding it. Appreciation did not exist in loud forms. Gratitude did not become a habit. There were no celebrations, no acknowledgments, no soft moments that balanced the pressure. There was only a steady understanding that things worked when I touched them and collapsed when I stepped away. A few months before the business looked stable, the tone inside my family changed. The first thing I noticed was how compliments started landing in places that felt unfamiliar, even when nothing serious had shifted in real work. Voices carried warmth in the wrong direction, while silence slowly gathered around the places where I stood. There was no announcement, no clear confrontation, only a quiet movement of attention that felt deliberate without ever being spoken aloud. Dad began speaking about Samantha with a pride that felt rehearsed, rather than natural. He praised her leadership in front of staff members, talked about her instincts with strangers present, and repeated her name in meetings where my presence went unrecognized. Mom followed those moments closely, offering smiles that lingered longer than necessary, allowing that version of the story to grow stronger every time it was repeated. I remained steady on the outside while watching a new reality being handed to others, like it had always belonged there. Outside the building, Samantha shaped the narrative with confidence. She spoke to vendors with ease, explained the business to visitors, and described my involvement as something light and supportive. When people started thanking her for decisions I had carried alone, I understood that the shift had moved beyond misunderstanding and into something intentional. The story was no longer shared, it was being rewritten. One afternoon, a manager approached me quietly, not with fear, but with a careful tone that suggested he had been thinking carefully about every word. He told me that he had been instructed not to bring reports directly to me anymore. He explained that changes in structure had already been discussed without my knowledge. He asked me to be patient, although patience felt meaningless when space was being taken away without consent. The storage area behind the kitchen became a place where truth existed without effort. I walked through narrow aisles while voices floated freely, believing they had privacy. My name was spoken without warmth, my role described as temporary, emotional, unnecessary. Each word pressed deeper than anger ever could, not because they were loud, but because they were calm. I did not interrupt, I did not correct, I did not defend myself, and silence wrapped around me while everything I had built was being reduced through whispers. Meetings began to happen without any notice to me. Chairs filled with people who had once asked for my guidance while calendars closed without my access. Conversations stopped the moment I entered rooms, as if my presence disrupted a new structure that was forming. My phone went quiet for decisions that once required my voice, and the distance grew without needing a single announcement. The most painful part was not losing credit but experiencing erasure in slow motion. No one ever said that I was no longer needed. No voices were raised. No arguments took place. They simply stopped including me, stopped acknowledging me, and stopped turning toward me when serious matters appeared. It was polite quiet, controlled and deeply damaging in ways that could not be debated. I stayed silent longer than was healthy, not because I felt weak, but because I believed fighting might destroy what little space I still held. Pride did not push me to demand recognition. Anger did not drive me to create scenes. Fear lived quietly in the background, shaping every decision to remain calm. I continued working in the spaces where I was still tolerated, watching the story drift further away from me with each passing week. By the time the changes became obvious to everyone else, they had already been complete inside me. One quiet Sunday night, my phone vibrated in a way I will never forget. The notification came through without warning, without tension, and without any sense of drama. Yet it carried a weight that felt heavier than any argument I had endured before. I had been sitting in silence, mentally revisiting open balances, supplier delays, and the quiet pressure of responsibility that had followed me for years, even when no one ever officially handed it to me. I reached for my phone with a neutral instinct, expecting nothing more than another routine message, another small problem to solve, another responsibility to quietly absorb without being asked. In that moment, I still believed that my role in the family was understood, even if it was never spoken out loud, and I still believed that loyalty had some invisible value that would not be erased so easily. Before I could scroll, the words were already there, waiting without hesitation, like they had been prepared long before that moment, as if the timing had been planned to catch me when I was most tired and least guarded. "We've decided you should step away for now," Dad texted. The message appeared in our family group chat, the same thread where plans used to circulate, where financial problems were shared casually, and where my input had once been requested only when things reached a breaking point. There was no warmth in the text, no softening language, no acknowledgement of effort or time, just a decision that clearly had been written long before it was ever sent. It felt like reading something official, something processed, something already discussed behind closed doors where my name had been spoken, but my voice had never been heard. In that instant, I realized I had not been part of the room for a very long time. There was no follow-up. There was no clarification. There was no attempt to make it easier to receive. Mom stayed silent, and that silence did not feel accidental. It felt coordinated, intentional, and final, like a quiet signature under an agreement I was never invited to see. I felt the absence of her words more sharply than anything that had been written, because it confirmed a shared decision rather than a moment of confusion. I read the message slowly, not because I failed to understand it, but because I understood it too clearly. This was not an invitation for discussion or a moment of hesitation. This was a done decision made somewhere I was never allowed to be approved quietly and delivered without hesitation. I typed carefully, choosing clarity over emotion control, over reaction, and distance over explanation. I replied, "I'll respect that," and step away from the family entirely. I did not justify myself or list sacrifices because explanations only matter when the people reading them still value the truth, and I could already feel that the truth no longer had a seat in that space. Seconds later, my older sister reacted to my message. She did not write back. She did not question anything. She simply tapped a celebration emoji and the symbol appeared beside my words, confirming without hesitation that the decision had brought relief rather than tension. That single symbol felt louder than any argument because it was honest in a way that words rarely are. The group chat went silent again, and this silence felt permanent. No one tried to soften anything. No one stepped in to repair damage. No one showed concern. The quiet felt deliberate, solid, and sealed like the final moment of a conversation that had ended long before I was ever told it was happening. In that silence, I finally understood that what I had called family had quietly moved on without me. That night did not end in shouting or tears. It ended in clarity. I had been removed not by accident but by agreement from a family that valued me only when I was useful and felt comfortable celebrating the moment I was no longer needed. The next morning started quietly, but my mind was already made up. I woke up without confusion, without hesitation, and without the familiar pressure of wondering how to fix problems that were never truly mine to begin with. The room felt ordinary. The light felt normal, but my thoughts moved with a clarity I had not felt in years. There was no anger driving me, and there was no desire to prove anything. There was only a calm decision that had finished forming while everyone else slept. I sat at my desk and opened the investment account that had carried more weight than most people understood. This was the account that had been used to keep the restaurant breathing, to stretch out time during supplier emergencies, and to cover gaps nobody wanted to admit existed. I logged in without rushing because I was no longer reacting, and I was no longer trying to save something that had already chosen to function without me. The numbers appeared clean and precise on the screen. I reviewed them once, not out of doubt, but out of habit. Then I initiated the transfer. I withdrew the entire $285,000, the exact amount I had invested to keep their business alive, and I watched the confirmation load without feeling triumph or regret. It felt procedural, like closing a chapter that had been left open far too long out of false hope. Immediately after I removed their access, I blocked every financial permission that had allowed them to touch the account. I revoked every shared authorization, every linked device, and every connected permission channel. I did not hesitate, because hesitation had already cost me enough time. I did not worry about how it would look, because I had spent too many years worrying about appearances while being erased quietly. Later that same morning, I contacted my attorney Victor, who had assisted me in previous legal documentation and financial protection matters. This was the first time his role mattered outside of quiet paperwork. I explained everything directly, without exaggeration, without emotional distortion, and without leaving space for interpretation. He listened in silence, which told me that what I described was not surprising but extremely clear. Victor began preparing immediate legal boundaries. He advised that I protect myself before the situation could be twisted into something legally dangerous. He advised that silence would be safer than explanation, and that documentation would be stronger than emotional conversations. That afternoon, I drafted the email. I did not overthink the language. I did not add dramatic sentences. I did not include personal pain. I simply wrote that I was terminating every legal and financial role associated with the business. I wrote that I was withdrawing any informal responsibilities. I wrote that I would not be available for consultation approvals, financial negotiation, or operational direction. Before sending it, I reread the email once, not for doubt, but for accuracy. Then I sent it. After the email left my screen, I sat still for a long time. There was no relief that crashed over me. There was no excitement. There was only a steady understanding that I had finally stopped pouring energy into a place that had quietly stopped seeing me as part of its structure. I felt grown grounded and very still. I did not check my phone for reactions. I did not wait for anger or apologies. I did not prepare defenses. I understood that the silence that would follow would be louder than any argument, and that it would belong to them, not to me. That morning changed everything, not because I was loud, but because I was finished. 1 week later, the damage started to appear everywhere. What had once looked like a stable operation began to feel fragile in ways nobody inside the family wanted to admit out loud. I did not need to watch from close range to understand what was happening, because the signals began arriving through people who had worked with us for years and no longer sounded confident when they spoke. The first collapse came from the seafood suppliers. They stopped confirming delivery schedules, ignored invoices, and delayed trucks without explanation. Old partners who had once trusted simple phone calls started requiring paperwork guarantees and proof of available capital before agreeing to move forward. Some simply stopped answering altogether, which created quiet panic inside operations that had relied on predictable supply chains. Soon after that, employees began leaving. Some were honest about their reasons and said they had heard rumors about instability in payroll. Others disappeared quietly, submitting resignation letters without confrontation or explanation. I learned through former supervisors that staff members were concerned about whether their wages would be protected and whether the restaurant could survive another month under unclear leadership. Banks and lenders began their own process of review. Existing loans were flagged, documents were requested again, and legal departments started inspecting the structure of the business with new intensity. Agreements that had once been signed without hesitation suddenly came under formal scrutiny. Clauses that had never mattered began to matter, and the legal language started to tighten around every transaction. Inside the company, Samantha was pushed into visibility in ways she had never experienced before. Investors, auditors, and outside consultants began asking direct questions about her role, her authority, and her understanding of the financial systems. She was asked to explain operations she had rarely touched and decisions she had never personally handled. Meetings that once praised her now exposed how little control she actually had when pressure became real. Rumors of civil filing started to surface quietly. Attorneys began reaching out for records, timestamps, and agreements. Several parties began discussing potential legal action connected to misrepresentation, financial exposure, and corporate responsibility. The idea of civil action shifted from distant threat to structured preparation supported by documents that I knew existed because I had once helped organize them. What struck me most was not the chaos, but how predictable it all felt. For years, I had held fragile parts of the system together without being named, without being respected, and without being protected. Once those supports disappeared, nothing replaced them. Decisions began to slow, fear began to spread, and confidence collapsed in private conversations long before it showed publicly. Calls and messages began reaching my phone more frequently. Some came from people who sounded nervous. Some came from people who sounded apologetic. Others came from people who spoke carefully, choosing words that suggested they already knew the situation could not be repaired easily. I did not answer any of them. I did not respond. I watched from a distance that felt clean, controlled, and deserved. Mom and Dad stopped appearing in internal communications that used to feel automatic. My parents no longer sounded certain in their private exchanges. Control shifted from authority to damage control, and even that felt unstable. Samantha was left facing questions alone, carrying a version of responsibility she had never expected to hold without assistance. By the end of that week, the business no longer looked strong from the inside. It looked exposed. It looked vulnerable. It looked like something that had lost its true foundation long before anyone realized what was missing. I did not celebrate the collapse. I did not feel satisfaction from the unraveling. I felt clarity. Consequences do not arrive loudly. They arrive when the silence becomes impossible to ignore. 1 month later, my life felt stable for the first time. I no longer woke up scanning messages or checking updates that were never meant for me. My phone stayed quiet for longer stretches of time, and the silence felt earned rather than empty. The distance I had created began to feel natural, as if my mind had finally accepted that peace did not have to come with permission. Mom tried calling first. The number appeared on my screen early in the morning, stayed there for a few seconds, then disappeared when I chose not to pick up. Dad followed later that week with a voicemail that sounded careful, measured, and unfamiliar. There were no demands in their attempts this time, no assumptions, no pressure, only hesitation layered with a polite tone that had never been necessary before. My parents asked to meet, suggested we talk privately, and offered words about rebuilding and starting over without mentioning conditions. The family asked if I would consider coming back. They called it a chance to return away to fix things, a gesture of unity that sounded better in theory than it ever had in reality. There were promises of respect and statements about mistakes made. There were invitations to sit down and discuss roles. There were suggestions that everything could be balanced again if I agreed to step into the picture once more. I declined every version of the offer without anger, without debate, and without hesitation. I chose a different structure for my days. I built routines that answered only to my own standards and my own time. I opened accounts that belonged only to me and kept my finances separate from every form of shared control. My decisions no longer required approval or explanation, and that freedom felt steady instead of reckless. Work became focused. Growth became personal. Stability became something I created instead of something I begged to keep. I stopped measuring my worth through family roles or outdated expectations. The urge to prove myself faded as soon as I stopped standing in rooms that required performance. My life became quieter in the best way, filled with predictable routines, honest effort and outcomes that belonged only to my hands. Even my thoughts began to slow down, as if my mind had finally been given enough space to breathe without fear of interruption or correction. I learned something important through this process, and the lesson stayed simple. Boundaries are not acts of rebellion. They are acts of survival and self-respect, especially inside family relationships, where emotional history often replaces accountability. When you draw a line, you are not abandoning people. You are protecting the part of yourself that allows you to live without resentment, fear, or invisible debt. Real peace appears when you stop chasing validation from people who only value access. If you stayed with my story until this moment, I want to thank you for listening with an open mind and an honest heart. Your time matters, and your attention matters more than most stories ever acknowledge. If this experience touched you or reminded you of something personal, share your thoughts in the comments. I read them. I respect them. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and stay connected for more real stories like this.